I'd like to begin today with a story. It's a story about Rome's legendary second king, Numa Pompilius, and it comes from chapter 15 of the life of Numa, written sometime after 96 CE by the Middle Platonist philosopher and priest Plutarch of Chaeronea, someone familiar to many of us here, I think. Numa's piety and religious activities take a prominent place in this biography. In chapter 15, which will be my focus today, Plutarch tells a cluster of stories that reveal, he says, how much religious influence Numa had over the Romans. According to Plutarch, Numa trained the Romans to believe that he had personal, face-to-face interactions with supernatural beings, such as the Nympheteria and even the Roman god Jupiter. But Plutarch adds that this was a disposition towards the divine, a diathesis pros to theon, that was not confined to Numa's subjects. It was shared by the king himself. And here's what Plutarch writes. These mythical and laughable tales show the attitude towards the divine of human beings at that time, the time of Numa, an attitude which habituation had produced in them. And then Plutarch goes on to tell us one more story here in chapter 15, as you can see. And they say that Numa himself was so dependent upon, or even so hung up on, his hopes in regards to the divine, that even when a message was once brought to him that enemies were approaching, he smiled and said, "But I am sacrificing." So my presentation has its germ in a question. Why does Numa smile during sacrifice in this story from Plutarch? Now, what you see here on the slide is all that Plutarch gives us by way of explanation. There's no clarification on what Numa's hopes in regards to the divine were. There's no further detail on what this smile meant. The story is brief, more of an anecdote, really. And I've found no other versions of it besides this one here in Plutarch. It's also a little bit odd. I don't know about you, but when I imagine Romans performing sacrifice, I don't typically imagine them grinning or smiling from ear to ear. The tale has attracted a few sentences in passing from some classicists, as well as a more detailed discussion by Hans-Dieter Betz. But today I'd like to see what more we can do with the tale, with this image of Numa's smiling persistence in sacrifice. So in this talk, I aim to do three things. Firstly, I will explore the possible meanings of Numa's smiling sacrifice. I will suggest that Plutarch sees Numa's behavior as arising from his belief that the gods can be relied upon, a belief accompanied and marked by positive affect, by an attitude of trust, hope, and confidence in the divine, even when circumstances look grim. The theological implications are that the gods are reliable, trustworthy, and able to help. Secondly, I will argue that this story, seemingly so isolated, terse, and even odd, actually draws on a broader cultural trope in the ancient Mediterranean, an image we can find elsewhere of characters who are able to smile in the face of danger because they have trust and confidence in the divine. Thirdly, and finally, taking up Giulietta and Kate's invitation in this series to share approaches that may help in rethinking Roman religions, I will endeavor to use today's presentation as an illustration of how we can find evidence for ancient beliefs and theologies, even in passages that do not feature explicit theological statements about what the gods were believed to be like. So the rest of my talk will work through three questions. What does Numa's smile mean? Are there other examples? And what might this tell us about ancient theologies? Let's dive in. So far, I've found 3 other scholars who comment on Pneuma's smile in this story, and I think there is great value in what they have to say. In his 2011 discussion of emotions in Roman religion, John Shade remarks briefly that Pneuma's behavior exemplifies the characteristically Roman value of fides, which he defines as, I translate, unshakable confidence in the credit which rites correctly performed hold in the eyes of the gods. Shade envisions Pneuma as trusting in the Roman sacrificial divine human economy, believing that the gods will protect him from the threatened harm because they reward those who sacrifice to them. As Shade puts it, the piety of Pneuma rests upon the pact concluded with the gods, according to which they defend those who offer them the prescribed homage. Shade's Pneuma then trusts the gods to rescue him here and now, in the moment the story is set. And Darya Sterbank-Erker, who I see is here today, nice to see you, Darya. She has also noticed this story and comments on it. And she says, I translate, the legend exemplifies how much the mythical king Pneuma trusted in the gods and in his perfect communication with them. In 2 papers from 2007, Hans-Dieter Betz provides a longer discussion, offering 3 possible interpretations of Pneuma's smile. All right, so 3. The first one, first possibility, is that Pneuma is imagined as hoping that even if he's killed during this sacrifice, maybe he'll become a god, as Rome's first king Romulus does in some traditions. The second possibility suggested by Betz is that Pneuma is portrayed as experiencing the mental peace of the philosopher while sacrificing. And this is why, even as enemies approach, he doesn't panic. He can just keep on smiling. The third possibility, which Betz appears to prefer, is that Pneuma is portrayed as believing that his sacrifice would, I quote, secure the support of the gods against a military onslaught. By performing the sacred act of sacrifice, Pneuma could simply dismiss the danger with a smile. I think these colleagues are right to see Pneuma's smiling sacrifice as exhibiting confidence or trust in the gods. I think there's also mileage in Betz's second suggestion that Pneuma's smile conveys the tranquility of the philosopher, and I'm going to come back to that idea in a few minutes. Right now, I'd like to delve deeper into the significance of Pneuma's smiling persistence in sacrifice, because I think it raises questions that invite further exploration. For example, can we know that Pneuma is trusting the gods to rescue him physically and personally in this very situation, rather than, for example, trusting the gods to give him a happy afterlife or to preserve his family or his city at the cost of his own life? Does Pneuma's trust really require unshakable confidence that the gods protect those who sacrifice to them? So let's take a look at the passage again. As we can see, Pneuma performs 2 actions in response to the approach of his enemies. He smiles, and he says that he is sacrificing. Now, the fact that he speaks here suggests the presence of some kind of human interlocutors. Shade posits there's a panicking entourage around him, and that could be right. Or maybe he's talking to the messenger who brought the report. Perhaps we should not discount the additional possibility that Pneuma's behavior is directed primarily towards the gods to whom he is sacrificing. It could also be them he is addressing, but a human audience seems likely. So what's happening? Grammatically, Pneuma's utterance might simply be contrasting the enemy's action with his own. Enemies are coming, but I am sacrificing. But this would be a mere statement of fact, and hardly, we'd imagine, one that whomever he is addressing would need to have pointed out. So the story must have had more resonance than this to catch Plutarch's attention. Pneuma's insistence on sacrifice must therefore be contradicting the reactions, expectations, and advice of his audience in response to the enemy advance. So, what are these invisible people to be imagined as saying? The possibilities range from exclamations of despair, "We're all going to die," to pragmatic suggestions for resistance. "You should rally the troops, pick up your sword, flee to higher ground," and so on. In any case, Pneuma's response seems to convey that he sees sacrifice as a way of dealing with the danger. Now, why does he think this? And what does he hope sacrifice will do for him here? There are several possibilities. One is that, as previously suggested, Pneuma expects the gods to reward his piety by rescuing him from the present danger. Now, much Roman and Greek ritual activity can indeed be understood as powered by a normative expectation that the gods have motives or commitments to reward and protect those who honor them. Moreover, Plutarch appears to have miracles in mind in the rest of chapter 15. So, as I mentioned earlier, in this chapter, Plutarch has told a series of stories, and we're talking here about the third one, about Pneuma's smiling sacrifice. But let's take a look for a moment at those two other tales that, according to Plutarch, illustrate the disposition towards the divine of the men of that time, Pneuma's time. One myth is that Pneuma once invited members of the Roman elite to his home for dinner. They all sat down in front of an empty table, wondering what was going on, no doubt, and suddenly a splendid feast appeared before them with every delicacy they could imagine. And Pneuma claimed that the nymph Egeria was responsible, that she was his advisor and lover, and she had performed this miracle just for him. The other myth involves Pneuma's supposed face-to-face dealings with Jupiter on the Aventine Hill. So this is the story that Jupiter once demanded, or appeared to demand, that the Romans offer him human sacrifice. But Pneuma negotiated with him, ultimately bartering the god down and making him gracious, as Plutarch calls it, through animal and vegetable offerings instead. So what are these myths telling us? They present the gods as capable of spontaneous miracles, not just gods, but also nymphs like Egeria. They present them as willing to interact with human beings. They present them as at least sometimes gracious and benevolent towards human beings. And in the case of the Jupiter story, they show them as being made gracious and benevolent by correct ritual practice. As Plutarch summarizes, through tales such as this, Pneuma succeeded in persuading his fellow Romans to, I translate, think nothing incredible or impossible, which Pneuma wished them to believe or do. So perhaps Plutarch did imagine Pneuma in our story on this slide as trusting the gods to intervene immediately against his enemies. It's also possible, though, that Plutarch's Pneuma is not imagined as expecting immediate help, but instead is committed to sacrificing and to honoring the gods, whatever the immediate cost. One problem with the theory that Pneuma expects imminent rescue is that it seems to make this often calculating character, who's credited with things like propagating the noble lie, a very crafty and careful leader. It seems to make him unrealistically naive. Greeks and Romans were well aware that bad things happened to good people, and they were also familiar with the idea that sacrifices might fail to appease the gods or to produce a desired outcome. In theory, Pneuma could have normative expectations of the gods' commitment to sacrifice, whilst also thinking, for example, that even if his army is wiped out, things will all work out for the best in the end. Or that even if he himself is killed, the gods will save the city. Or that the gods might not be able to help him right now, but they might do so at some point in the future. Other elements of Plutarch's portrait of Pneuma support this idea that he was imagined as valuing the act of honoring the gods more highly than anything else. Now, we know that Plutarch praises Pneuma as a model of religiosity, conspicuous not just for the standard virtue of piety, eusebia, but also for his caution or scruples concerning the divine. So again, his peritotheon eulabia. According to Plutarch, even before he became king, Pneuma devoted his hours of privacy and leisure not to enjoyments and money-making, but to the worship, the therapeia of the gods, and the rational contemplation of their nature and power. In chapter 14 of the life of Pneuma, Plutarch even tells us that Pneuma instituted rules at Rome to prevent all distractions during worship. He wanted his citizens to devote their complete and undivided attention to rituals. So you can see here, Pneuma thought that his citizens ought neither to hear nor see any divine rituals while they were occupied with other matters and therefore unable to pay attention. They should rather be free from all distractions and devote their attention to piety as a matter of the highest importance. They should also rid their streets of noise and clatter and clamor and all such accompaniments of menial and manual labor, and clear them for the sacrifices or the rituals. And the Romans still preserve some trace of this. Pause for water. Now, although Plutarch here seems to present this as an admirable thing, an admirable decision, he also mentions some criticisms, which he claims Pneuma attracted or feared from contemporaries because of the unusual extent of his commitment to worshiping the gods. So I give you a couple of examples here. In the passage on the left of your screen, we have Rome's representatives arriving at Pneuma's country residence and Sabine land to offer him the kingship. But Pneuma declines, saying that the Romans are too warlike to appreciate his style of piety. If anything, they will find his devotion to divine therapeia laughable, gelos. In the passage on the right side of your screen, Plutarch indicates that this suspicion was borne out after Pneuma's death. He shows Pneuma's successor, Tullus Hostilius, mocking Pneuma's piety as making people idle and womanlike. Now, here in the life of Pneuma, Plutarch dismisses Hostilius's criticism as juvenile, but in another of his treatises on the fortune of the Romans, he concedes that it might just have been justified. So he sort of contradicts himself in an interesting way. I'll show you that passage next. It's a little longer. But Pneuma gained time by good fortune to consolidate and make assured the enlargement of Rome, securing much peace and much quiet. But if at that time a Porsenna had pressed hard upon the city and had erected an Etruscan stockade and a camp beside the new walls, which were still moist and unstable, I like this image of the mushy walls, or if from the Marsi had come some new rebellious chief filled with warlike frenzy, or some Lucanian incited by envy and love of strife, arming all Italy at one time by preconcerted signal, as it were, if one of these had sounded his trumpets about Pneuma the philosopher while he was sacrificing and praying, the early beginnings of the city would not have been able to hold out against such a mighty surge and billow, nor would they ever have increased to such a goodly and numerous people. So what we see here is an admission that Pneuma was so committed to worshiping the gods that he could not have been relied upon to stop sacrificing and praying, even in the face of the imminent destruction of the city. Plutarch's conclusion is that the Romans were just lucky that no major enemies chose to attack during Pneuma's reign. This is a very striking admission from Plutarch, given that although his portrait of Pneuma is not uniformly positive, he sees Pneuma as, in many ways, the embodiment of the philosopher king. So in this passage, what's Pneuma's reasoning? It seems to be that Therapeia of the immortals should take priority over human concerns. And I think it may be this same determination to persist with sacrifice, even in the face of danger, that Plutarch also has in mind when he tells the story of Pneuma's smiling sacrifice. If Pneuma declined to stop his sacrifice because worship of the gods must come first, we can see how this hierarchy of values could result in what Hostilius supposedly alleged. It could look like a foolhardy refusal to do practical things, making people idle. It could look like a reluctance to fight that could be caricatured as cowardice, which Greeks and Romans stereotyped as feminine. So perhaps that's what Plutarch's Hostilius means when he talks about Pneuma's piety making people womanlike. Maybe it made them cowardly. Importantly, Plutarch's authorial admission here that the Romans would have been wiped out if danger had materialized during Pneuma's sacrifices, in itself admits that his piety might not have been, perhaps even would not have been, rewarded with imminent rescue in the here and now. So perhaps Plutarch's Pneuma is hung up on his hopes with regard to the gods in the sense that he is committed to putting them first, no matter what. Now, whichever view we prefer, whether we think Plutarch's Pneuma expects to be saved right away, or whether we think he trusts in the gods' higher purposes, regardless of his physical safety, there remains an element of the story that we haven't fully parsed yet, and that's the positive affect that Pneuma displays. The way this disposition towards the divine keeps him not just sacrificing, but smiling. To understand better why Pneuma smiles, I'm going to draw on two strands of research. The first strand is scholarship on trust in antiquity, and the second strand is scholarship on Greek and Roman smiles and laughter. So let's take trust first. Teresa Morgan and Dan McCoyne have shown convincingly that trust, pistis or fides, in the ancient Mediterranean was not understood primarily as a process of cognition requiring propositional belief that X. And here I'd like to take a moment to thank Teresa and Dan and Michael Pace for helping me in an earlier stage of this paper during their Templeton Foundation project on trust in God. Any errors, of course, remain mine. Now, many scholars today see trust as having an affective component, in that it involves optimism and positive expectations about the conduct of the trustee and the consequences of that conduct. So trust can be characterized as hopeful, forward-looking, and often as involving positive feelings on the part of the trustor towards the trustee. In Morgan's words, divine human trust in Greece and Rome involves, I quote, hopes that the gods will prove trustworthy, favorable, and helpful. And I think Plutarch's picture of Pneuma smiling during sacrifice satisfies this condition nicely, because Plutarch explicitly describes Pneuma as acting out of hopes with respect to the divine. It is this positive, optimistic hope about the gods which enables us to rule out other possibilities, the possibility that Pneuma persists in sacrificing due to negative emotions or negative expectations about the gods. So in theory, without this, he might have kept going out of fear that the gods would punish him if he stopped his sacrifice, no matter how good his reasons were. Or maybe he persisted out of apathy, induced by the belief that the gods take no interest in his plight, and so it doesn't matter what he does. But this hope reminds us that here he is acting out of positive expectations about what the gods will do for him, whatever we specifically take that to be. Now, Plutarch himself endorses throughout his works a Platonist conception of God as morally good and well disposed towards human beings. And since he characterizes Pneuma as having a correct understanding of the gods, we may take it that he sees Pneuma as holding the same views that he holds himself. So that's very handy. If Pneuma agrees with Plutarch, he must be right. Plutarch, of course, must be right. And so we can infer that Plutarch imagines Pneuma too as crediting the gods with care and goodwill towards human beings. And what else can we say about this positive affect? In several treatises, Plutarch also asserts that ritual practices, as well as a virtuous ethos or way of being, reduce negative emotions. They reduce anxiety, fear, suspicion. Ritual practices and virtuous living conduce, on the other hand, towards hope, elpis, serenity, galene, laughter, courage, and to feelings that are joyous, phaedros, and cheerful, hilaros. And Plutarch insists, importantly, that this is true even when current temporal circumstances are not favorable. So even when the wise person is experiencing loss, pain, and suffering, ritual practice, virtuous living can induce joyous, cheerful, smiling attitude. Now, these adjectives for this mindset, phaedros and hilaros, both feature in the lexica of smiles and laughter in ancient Greek. So when Plutarch talks about experiencing cheerful feelings or joyful feelings, for his readers, that this might also have called to mind the image of someone smiling in a calm and peaceful way. So we can see how, for Plutarch's Pneuma, a cheerful, smiling persistence in sacrifice expresses, or at least hints at, beliefs about the nature of the gods. It implies that they're able to help in times of trouble, and that somehow, for those who honor them, things will come out right in the end. And that brings me to our next question. How does Pneuma's trusting smile compare to other examples from Greek and Roman literature? There is an extensive and learned body of work on the significance Stephen Halliwell, Marie-Laurence Desclos, and Mary Beard, among many others. In this part of my presentation, I'd like to consider how Plutarch's smiling Pneuma might be brought into comparison and conversation with this vein of scholarship. The scholarship on ancient smiles has not, to my knowledge, talked about Pneuma's smiling Plutarch, but it does offer some possible ways of explaining that smile. The wisest participant in a Platonic dialogue is sometimes said to smile at the suggestions of less experienced interlocutors. And this philosophical smile of the wise man, the sourire du sage, has been spotted in other works of Plutarch by Daniel Babu and Françoise Frazier. These scholars define such a smile either as gently tempering a rebuke or correction, or as demonstrating the philosopher's sense of superiority to someone who is in error. With respect to smiles in Greek literature more broadly, Dominique Arnould demonstrated that the formula used in our passage, he or she smiled and said, mediasai kai epein, is common for rejoinders, where it serves to punctuate or emphasize the speech that follows. So Pneuma is smiling, but I am sacrificing, could fall under these headings. Perhaps we're to imagine Pneuma as knowing something about sacrifice which the messenger or these other invisible companions do not know. And perhaps he uses this smile to mark this when he addresses them. If so, what is it that he knows that they don't know? Well, I'd suggest that his beliefs about the well-disposed nature of the gods and the importance of worship and sacrifice in winning their goodwill would be good candidates. Now, as many here will know, smiles are also used broadly in Greek literature to illustrate the sense of peace and calm, galene, of the philosopher who has attained the appropriate distance from the world and its temporal threats and challenges. And Plutarch does this too. For example, in his treatise on controlling anger, he reports that Socrates was in the habit of smiling when he felt himself on the verge of getting too angry with his friends, as a means of controlling his passion, his pathos. This might be a good tip for a lot of us these days on social media and elsewhere. This supports Hans-Dieter Betz's suggestion mentioned earlier in my talk, that Pneuma's smile helps to characterize him as philosophically enlightened and in control of his emotions. But when we compare this particular smile to other examples in Greek and Roman literature, I think we can suggest that it conveys more than just galene. Smiles can also involve the gods. Arnould notes that characters smile as a sign that they accept what the gods have decreed. For example, Calypso smiles when she agrees, in accordance with Zeus's command, to send Odysseus on his way in the Odyssey. And Romain Pret observes that in the Greek novels of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, protagonists sometimes smile when they are aware of what the gods are doing, or when their actions align with the divinely directed plot of the novel. So here I give you 2 examples from the Syrian writer Heliodorus's Ethiopian story of Theogonies and Chariclea, a Greek novel written around 230 CE. In these passages, the hero and heroine to whom prophecies of good fortune have been given have been captured and threatened with slavery or death. So this is typical of the Greek novel, these melodramatic episodes where people experience terrible possible hardship, but somehow come through for a happy ending. So you can see how here we have that vocabulary of smiles and laughter manifesting again. Chariclea is cheerful, Phaedros, and smiling of face. And even when her lover is downcast, we can see in the passage on the left, she smiled and endeavored to change Theogonies' mind, reminding him of what had been predicted by the gods and soothing him with more propitious hopes. Now, Brett focuses on how these smiles function to characterize the protagonists of the novels as a way of marking their awareness of what the gods are doing. And I think that's right. What strikes me here is the similarities to Pneuma's smile. Both Pneuma and Chariclea smile despite or in the face of external danger, and both are said to be moved by hopes related to the divine. Their behavior is similar in that it displays a disposition towards the divine, to use Plutarch's words, that is trusting and reliant. Another water break. It's very dry in Calgary. I wish I was experiencing the wonderful British humidity right now. Now, these kinds of smiles also occur in early Christian literature in Greek and Latin. Although many ancient Christian writers had doubts about the appropriateness of laughter, this is what Stephen Halliwell calls an anti-gelastic tendency in early Christianity. Many writers nevertheless accepted that smiles and even laughter could be markers of certain Christian beliefs or experiences. For example, the joy one experiences in the presence of God. A smile could express confidence that one will be united with God in the afterlife, or it could indicate positive expectations about the eschaton. Christians are even sometimes portrayed as smiling during suffering and martyrdom. I won't delve into those examples right now due to time constraints, but it's something that we can definitely discuss in the conversation later on if people are interested. In the persuasive analysis of Stephanie Cobb, the laughter of Christians in the midst of pain and suffering functions as an act of resistance to persecution. Cobb writes, I quote, "The dark humor in martyr texts can support an author's theological claims about the superiority of Christian beliefs to pagan ones. It can undergird the claims to a reality that stands in contradistinction to appearances. It can forge bonds among Christian listeners as they laugh together with their martyrs at the ineffective and thus senselessly barbaric actions of their persecutors." Remo Caccitti adds that such smiles can be understood as the expression of faith in the fulfillment of biblical prophecies or the joy of the martyr at being deemed worthy to enter the presence of God through death. In addition to martyr texts, we can also find smiles displaying a trustful disposition towards God in Christian hagiography. And I'm going to give you my final example for today. This is a longer passage, so I'll use 2 slides to make sure we get the whole thing. This comes from a biography by St. Jerome, The Life of Hilarion, and which was written in Bethlehem around 390 to 393 CE. The Life of Hilarion is a rousing and action-packed tale. Hilarion travels around the Mediterranean, giving the devil a good kicking, and he often smiles as he's doing it. So in this example, Saint Hilarion is out walking when he encounters a demon-possessed man. As the saint was walking with the brethren and expounding some passage of scripture, the man broke from the hands of his keepers, clasped him from behind, and raised him aloft. There was a shout from all, for they feared lest he might crush his limbs, wasted as they were with fasting. So kudos to Hilarion here for being a good ascetic. He's very feeble due to all his fasting. But the saint smiled and said, "Be quiet, and let me have my rival in the wrestling match to myself." Oh dear, sorry. My power cable has just cut out. Give me 1 second so I don't suddenly disappear from you all here. Did that fix it? Yes, okay. Sorry about that. All right, so be quiet and let me have my rival in the wrestling match to myself. So the next time someone tells you ancient Christians never crack jokes, we can think of this passage. Now the story has a happy ending. Hilarion is apparently equipped with supernatural strength, and we get this kind of WWF wrestling moves. He bent back his hand over his shoulder till he touched the man's head, seized his hair, and drew him round so as to be foot to foot with him. He then stretched both his hands in a straight line and trod on his 2 feet with both his own. This is very, very vigorous. Well, he cried out again and again, "To torment with you, you crowd of demons, to torment." The sufferer shouted aloud and bent back his neck till his head touched the ground, while the saint said, "Lord Jesus, release this wretched man, release this captive. Yours it is to conquer many, no less than one." Now, as in Pneuma's case, so here again, the smile is a response to imminent physical danger, rooted in trust in a God's power. In his survey of ascetic attitudes towards smiles and laughter, Francesco Trisolio categorizes this under the smile as an emanation of sincere joy of spirit. And I think this is a good start. Hilarion often does come across in this biography as a sort of cheerful fellow. But as will be clear by now, I think that his smile here is more than an expression of joy. It's also a marker of his trust and hope in the divine, like the trust and hopes of Heliodorus's Charicleia and of Plutarch's Pneuma. Now, these smiles have not previously been compared with each other, perhaps because the genres and imagined circumstances in which they occur are so different. If we focus on the content of the propositions about the divine that each of these characters might be imagined as accepting, there are obvious differences. Hilarion believes different things about the divine than Charicleia does, or even than Plutarch's Platonist Pneuma does. Hilarion isn't even talking about the same God. When we look at the behavior attributed to these characters, though, there is a family resemblance. Charicleia has positive and optimistic expectations about the god's conduct, characterized explicitly by hope, elpis. Hilarion's friends, like Pneuma's messenger and his possible human bystanders, they react to his danger with fear and concern, but Hilarion is cheerful and unperturbed, acting in reliance on his God. Each situation confronts the characters with physical danger, which functions as a challenge or as possible counter evidence to their attitude towards the divine, and to which they nevertheless respond with resilience. In each story, we also have other characters who, it seems, do not share the hero's confidence. This generates dramatic tension, of course, but it also shows that the response attributed to characters such as Pneuma is exceptional, perhaps an ideal to aspire to rather than a norm of daily life. And in each story, the protagonist's smile rebuts the fears of others, expressing and conveying hope and confidence that a god or gods will somehow make things work out for the best. Whilst the identity and associated myths of the god involved may differ, the theological implication is the same. The gods are trustworthy, and that they will ultimately help those who honor them, even if suffering must come first. So what might this tell us about ancient theologies? In this paper, I have suggested that for Plutarch, Pneuma's smiling sacrifice demonstrates a hopeful and cheerful commitment to the worship of the gods. Pneuma's behavior is predicated on his beliefs about the gods and their nature. Plutarch may or may not have imagined Pneuma as believing that the gods would save him in that moment. There are other possibilities, as we've seen. But Plutarch did credit Pneuma with the conception of the gods as trustworthy, able to help him, and able to ensure that everything would be all right in the end. Comparing this brief story in Plutarch with other examples from Greek and Roman literature, I have proposed that the smile of Plutarch's Pneuma can be understood not just as an expression of that king's reputed trust in the sacrificial economy or in his own relationship with the gods, but as one example of a broader cultural trope, wherein a character's calm smile in the face of danger conveys and expresses something theological, a hopeful confidence that the gods are worthy of trust. Now, as I've mentioned, this level of confidence is not portrayed as universal. So the smile is, I would say, a kind of flex. It's a display by the enlightened protagonist of their own correct or superior theological understanding. Something that readers might aspire to, perhaps, but not necessarily a behavior they would have exhibited in the same circumstances or in everyday life. So in this paper, I've endeavored to show how characters or individuals might have beliefs that differ in precise content, but that produce similar religious experience or behavior, which is in turn indicative of broader similarities on a theological level. Characters could believe different things and yet still subscribe, if we were able to ask them, to similar theological propositions. And this, I think, encourages ongoing comparison of ancient pagan and Christian religious experiences and conceptions of the divine nature. We need to keep looking for those aspects of ancient theologies that constituted shared cultural currency. I hope that my presentation also illustrates how behavior and anecdotes can be read as evidence for beliefs and theology, even in the absence of explicit theological statements. And here I'm drawing inspiration from the work of Esther Eidenau, Julia Kint, and collaborators on Greek theologies, who define theology as including, I quote, not only explicit, systemic, and generalized theories about the divine, but also the verbal or pictorial articulation of certain conceptions of, attitudes towards, or questions about gods, which may suggest, in a more or less underdetermined and vague way, certain possible sets of beliefs about gods and are reasonably explicable in terms of those sets of beliefs. So in my current work, I've been exploring ways that we might be able to find more evidence for Greek and Roman beliefs and theology beyond explicit statements that the gods are such and such, or the gods are like so and so. We already have many excellent studies of what Romans and Greeks said the gods were like, and the most explicit sources, such as philosophical treatises, are often already well mined. I'd like to see what else we can glean from stories and behaviors that are more elliptical. In our case today, Plutarch, perhaps surprisingly for him actually, he doesn't tell us exactly what Pneuma was thinking in this story. But Pneuma's words, actions, even his facial expression can still have something to tell us about what he was supposed to have thought the gods were like. Finally, I hope to have shown how one concise, seemingly isolated, and cryptic story can be an invitation to explore playfully and perhaps even cheerfully the religions of the ancient world. Thank you very much.